I'm going to apologize for the next session. It's prior to lunch, so I can make the most boring portion of it be prior to lunch. This is like regulations and stuff. And, good luck. Hope you make it through. This section is Clean Water Act Basics. I just want to point out a few things. And along the way, there's always going to be a picture, some sort of treatment unit, because this is the master class, and it's driving home the point. Treatment's the deal. Clean Water Act involves lots of agencies, the EPA and the regions and Department of Justice from the federal government, state water, state AGs, DAs from the state level, and then you all, the counties, municipalities, sewer districts. It's just a lot of, I was into this one case, Shell Oil Refinery, when they spilled oil in 1989 into the bay. We had our first meeting, and there was like 2 Shell guys over there, and there were 28 agencies on this side. And I thought, wow. You all be quiet, we're EPA. That's what. There were 28 agencies. It's amazing. So there's a lot of regulatory control. Even in pre-treatment, there's at least these. It involves federal, state, local governments. The federal side, there's technology-based effluent limits. And if you remember from the last time, I said when I first got to EPA, this old guy from Nevada who worked at EPA for many years prior to me and for the Federal Water Pollution Control Agency prior to that, he says, son, I'm going to teach you Clean Water Act. There's technology-based standards and water quality-based standards. If you get that, you got it. And you just, okay. That's it. There's federal technology-based effluent limits. There's waivers from that, 301H waivers. And then the water quality standard side of it is centered in the state. So the state has the water quality standards themselves. In the receiving waters, water quality-based effluent limits, and there's certifications that go with that. And then you all, at the level of protecting your sewage treatment plant and yet discharging to waterways that the state says there's water quality standards that the state comes up with that you have to meet for your discharge, and the federal government says we have various rules upon you, including technology-based standards. Here you are, the pretreatment regulations, sewage sludge regulations, stormwater, anti-backsliding, anti-degradation. This is the rules that apply on your end. I want to point out that essentially, once again, the pretreatment regulations are an extension of the technology-based federal standards. Essentially, if those federal standards are applied at your sewage treatment plant because you have various metal finishers or industries coming into your system, you can't actually monitor for it. You can't actually do it. So they're extended out by the pretreatment regulations out to the sources of those non-compatible waste streams that are coming into sewage treatment plants. But really the whole system is to treat the wastewaters that are coming into a municipal system. What's the best places to do it? The pretreatment program pushes that regulation out to the sources. The national standards are essentially underneath this idea, the best available technology standards for various waste streams. Sewage treatment plants have a national best available technology standards. Metal finishers do, oil refineries do. The federal government has come up with a list of these various industries and come up with the technology-based standards. And the way that they did it is that they looked at each of that kinds of industry and the treatment that was already in place, usually because there was a local issue for that facility or the river itself needed to be protected. So prior to having categorical standards, technology-based standards, they were looking at industries that had put in treatment anyway for other reasons. And they looked at it and said, here's our model treatment. This is the treatment that we think is, and these were people at EPA, we think is model for that type of industry, that type of discharge. And then they looked at the discharge quality from that type of model. And from that, they did a statistical regression of the data from that. And they said, we're going to set limits as the 99th percentile event. So if treatment is working, it's going to have a variability in it because of treatment. But that variability is now constricted because of treatment. So we're going to take the 99th percentile event. In other words, if a facility violates that 99% limit, then it's a sign that treatment's not occurring at all. It's because treatment is defined by the rest of the 99%, from 0 to 99. It's the median is what the treatment unit could do all the time. The 99th percentile is the very rarest event, so we're going to set the limit at that very rarest event. If you violate that, then it's sort of a great proof that treatment is either not there or not working right. So it's based upon treatment. It was the idea was that statistical regression. And the end result of having best available technology defined in the United States is that there's widespread treatment for all kinds of things everywhere. A lot of other countries fuss with this and don't have widespread treatment on their sources wherever they are. And a lot of countries in the world rely on the EPA's best available technology models to say that's what we're going to do. So the EU essentially uses all of this same technology. Widespread treatment comes from the one idea: we're going to establish and require best available treatment on every source of wastewater in the country. So Section 133 of the categorical technology-based standards are for municipal secondary treatment plants. So treatment plants have a technology-based standard, and because of that, almost every treatment plant is primary, secondary treatment plant. Then there's sections 407 to 471. They're the industrial wastewater effluent guidelines, also best available technology treatment. This designation, BPT, BAT, BPT is best practicable treatment. And by and large, best practicable treatment was, through a process of evaluation, determined to be best available technology treatment. It's lost in the mists of time about that, but the limits themselves are based on the idea that this is the best available treatment technology for that type of waste stream, defined by the federal government and established by doing that regression of existing models saying this is the rare event that system should be able to comply with all the time. And then after that, since a lot of these standards were developed in the 80s, there's new source performance standards as well, meaning that as technology gets better, there's some things that can be improved. In both of these cases, BAT and new source performance standards, this is for discharges to waterways, like an oil refinery that is on its own, that does not discharge to a sewer district, and discharges into a waterway on its own, for example. And then Section 403, pretreatment regulations, establishes those same ideas into discharges into sewer districts, with the exception that if the wastewater itself is treatable by the sewage treatment plant, there are not limits for that. So pretreatment standards, existing sources, is essentially BAT, best available technology, minus the treatment necessary for waste streams that will be treated by the sewage treatment plant. So there are no limits for a milk processor, for example, food processor. There are not going to be limits for that because the waste stream that a food processor produces is treatable by the sewage treatment plant secondary standards. Pretreatment standards for new sources just means that because technology increases, it gets better, the limits themselves constrict. They're primarily around, new sources are primarily around flow controls at a facility. That because you can control the flows differently, you have a treatment regime that's got a different variability. You're treating a more concentrated waste stream that now there's less of it, easier, better controls. So the limits themselves are primarily driven by that. Some of them are driven by the fact that some pollutants aren't to be discharged anymore. Cadmium, for example, the metal finishing standards for metal finishers, and it's an existing source, meaning it's been around since '83, you'll have a zinc limit. it'll have a cadmium limit. But the new source standards has a cadmium limit that is essentially the statistical zero at the time. And the idea is that you can't discharge cadmium. So the new source standards have a different limit because the idea is now no discharge of cadmium is possible. Instead, they have electrodialysis. That's how cadmium is supposed to be dealt with. And then because pretreatment regulations are establishing the technology requirement on waste streams in the country out into sewer districts, at the sources, there's prohibitions then in there as well that cover the fact that those things can cause trouble with a sewer district. Not just, you could meet a technology-based standard at a source that's in the sewer district, but that facility could still harm the sewer district. So there are prohibitions against interference, dilution, and bypassing. Does that make sense? Yeah, I've saved you 10 years of reading the regulations right there. This is what the Section 133 secondary treatment, best available technology for sewage treatment plants looks like. There they are, BOD, TSS, oil and grease, pH, total residual chlorine, that's essentially all there is. The only limits that have to do with secondary treatment for sewage treatment plants. Because sewage treatment plant treats for BOD, solids, chlorinates. That's all they do, yes.
So what you're saying is you would inspect those for the interference and pass-through abilities.
Yes, I would. This is you, though. This is a sewer district. You're hoping that we don't inspect that, the EPA. But this is the limit. These are the technology-based limits for a sewage treatment plant, essentially. Here's the technology-based limits for just direct dischargers only, meaning these limits only apply to, for example, 405 dairy facilities that discharge to a waterway. If the dairy facility discharged to a sewer district, there would be no categorical standards because the dairy facility makes a treatable waste stream. So here they are. They're mostly food, yes. I don't know why cement's in there, but it is. Soap manufacturing's in there for some of the subsections A through N and S, but the other ones, there are limits. Does that make sense? The Clean Water Act is when you see all the regulations and all the books that go with it, all the everything that's been written about it. It seems enormous, but the concept was pretty clear. Best available technology applied to waste streams going to waters of the United States. That's the idea. Now, what could go wrong? Well, they discharged to a sewer district. Okay, well, we got to advance that up there. What else could go wrong? Well, it could bypass. They could bypass around their treatment. Well, we don't want that because that short circuits the idea of best available technology. They could dilute the waste stream. No, so we got a prohibition against that. It's essentially the idea of best available technology applied to waste streams. That's the Clean Water Act in a nutshell.
Greg?
Yes.
You have a question.
Yes.
I was just going to ask, so if you have like a grain mill,
Yes.
but they're discharging to a POTW,
Yes.
are they still considered categorical?
No.
I mean, have limits.
No, they're not. Direct discharge standards only. There's essentially all there is for this is a BAT and a new source standard. They do not apply to discharges to facilities to a sewer district. And if that's the case, they're not a categorical. Yes,
I
sir.
was just going to say, in your opinion, do they have to have a permit? Or is it just the evaluation whether they're significant? And if they're not significant industrial user, then they don't have to have a permit?
These are not categorical. So they have to have a permit if they're a significant industrial user, an SIU, which includes categoricals. So they could still need a permit, but not because they're a categorical.
That's pretty much what I was going to say.
Okay.
They may be subject to local limitations.
This is one of the questions on your yellow quiz. Anyway, here's some more. Direct discharge standards only. There they are. Okay. The next set are the ones in which there are discharge standards into sewer districts, into POTWs, where there's either concentration-based limits or flow-based mass limits, or there's pH pretreatment standards. All of these that are listed here, there's some limit that is applied to that discharge if it goes to a sewer district, into a sewage treatment plant, into a sewer system. So cement manufacturing, but subpart A, it's covered. Organic chemicals, detergents, petroleum refining. Detergents, subparts O, R, Q, it should be O, P, Q, and R. That one is covered. Those subparts are, but the other ones aren't. Steam electrics covered. Blown glass, but only subpart M. Wood preserving, but only subparts G and H. You know, you'd have to go into the rule to figure what that is. But not everything is covered by has limits for discharges to sewer districts. Here's some more of them. Oh, wait a minute. I wanted to point out, the big one here is metal finishing, right? And the reason why this is a big one, it's actually, the big ones are that one, and that one. The reasons for this one in particular is that for metal finishing was considered the standard that everything is going to apply to everything that had metals. And so it has a qualification that's very easy to get into. Does it do any etching, plating, electrolysis plating, anodizing? There's 6, and I'm having a printed circuit board manufacturing and chemical...
Etching and milling.
Etching and milling. No, there's another, chemical coating. And those 6 qualifications are broadly interpreted, meaning if it's metal in acid at all, even if it's just removing just barely the smallest amount of oxide on the outside that's been formed, it qualifies. Because it was meant to qualify, everything was meant to qualify in. And then that category then says, unless these things don't happen, unless it qualifies for these other operations. So many of the other categories apply, like metals molding, aluminum forming. These have their own standards. So the way that the categorical standards were written is that the metal finishing standards essentially apply to almost everything unless they apply it to some other category. So semiconductors don't apply, aluminum forming doesn't apply, but they have to qualify out of metal finishing is essentially how that works. It was meant to be the one that everything is regulated by. So it's easy to qualify into that if there's metals. Petroleum refining is this broad thing. If it had anything to do with petroleum, refining, even in the smallest amount, is just this one limit that applies to everything that any of those facilities do. Doesn't matter if it's stormwater on the facility. It doesn't matter if it's tank wash down. It's just this broad idea that everything that from a place that does a lot of oil handling, it's got to discharge through a certain type of best available technology. And then centralized waste treatment is the fact that nowadays many things come into a facility whose purpose is to treat all these untreatable waste streams. So this category is complicated and applies all the time. So those 3 were the main ones, this one, and this one. And then here, these are the rest of the categories. This one is, somebody has one of these, right? Transportation equipment cleaning. Yeah. Okay, yes.
I've always found it odd that some of these categories, the way they control discharge to the sewer is say you can't discharge.
Well, so
Can you comment on?
please do not jump ahead. So these are the standards that have concentration-based, flow-based mass, or pH pretreatment standards. These are the only categories in which there is an actual discharge that's allowed that you treat for, and here's a limit. Okay? That's these. These are the only ones. There's a whole bunch of them. Oh, here's production. I'm sorry. There's also production-based mass limits as well. These ones also have limits that there's an amount, there's a discharge that's treated. Here's the list of categories in which there is a federal requirement that they cannot discharge something. what you're talking about. There they are. Steam electric, you can't discharge any fly ash water or PCBs. Paint formulation, can't discharge anything that's oil-based, wastewaters from oil-based paint formulation. Ink formulation, same thing. Does that make sense? So there's three categories, there's three sets of federal limits essentially. There's limits that apply only to discharges that go to waterways. There's limits that apply to discharges that go to sewer districts and that they're concentration-based, production-based, mass-based, pH. It's an actual limit for a discharge. And then there are limits that apply to facilities that could discharge to a sewer district, and they're prohibitions. You're not allowed to discharge these particular waste streams. Three different things. Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
The question regarding categorical operations, why is it then that BAT technology, which is based off of discharges that are direct discharges, applied to the standards for indirect dischargers? When we're looking at whether or not, or evaluating on whether or not whatever they have is sufficient to meet the standard.
It's that the limits, the standards for discharges to sewer districts are best available technology, are reflective of best available technology, because the idea in the country is best available technology applies to wastewater discharges. But if it's going to a sewer district, minus the treatment that's necessary to, the treatment that would be necessary if there was no sewer district. That the sewage treatment plant itself treats for BOD, TSS, BOD and TSS. Since it does that, then the limits that apply to discharges into a sewer district still has BAT for other things, but not for BOD and TSS.
So the spirit is if this facility were a direct discharger, they would have to meet BAT.
Yes. And the spirit is together, the BAT, the limits, the treatment applied at the sources, at upstream, and the treatment applied at the sewage treatment plant together apply BAT to the whole system, best available technology to the whole system. So there's just not a duplication of it upstream. Does that make sense? Okay. So the point here is that there are a number of federal categorical standards that are prohibitions against discharge to sewers. If you have a steam electric plant, that's a categorical, even though they're not required. It's because there's a federal requirement that they cannot discharge this waste stream. Does that make sense? I put this here because, somebody, I don't know if they do this anymore, but I would grade you down when I would come through as an audit. I found an ink formulation plant, and it's not one of them, you don't have a permit for them that tells them that they cannot discharge oil-based waste streams. Okay. So that's one side. Technology-based standards apply to everything in the country, essentially, is what the idea was. Second point is now, what's the effect? Water quality-based standards. Two things together. Technology is going to be applied to, treatment's going to be applied to everything. But is it effective? Is there effects on the wastewater, on the water receiving waters themselves? So states have been given the authority, have the authority to come up with water quality standards. And it's a complicated method. How many of you have had to go through the MPDS permit process at your district? How many of you have gone through all the reasonable potential analysis and everything that's involved in it? Is super complicated. And I used to just go, oh yeah, do it. Until I had to do it as a consultant, it was super hard. Anyway, water quality pollutants of concern, there's discharge prohibitions, whole effluent toxicity limits that apply as well, acute and chronic, best management practices. The MPDS permit, the permit that applies to the sewer district itself, has water quality standards applied to it. And that permit is very technical analysis to come up with what these limits are. Here's some of the contaminants of emerging concern. The surfactant detergent stuff, that nobody used to think anything about that stuff, but there's all kinds of toxicity from surfactants, for example. Antifoulant biocides. Cooling towers have antifoulant biocides in them. So a city that has a lot of cooling towers for some reason, you might have trouble at your sewage treatment plant. The effluent itself might kill fish because you've got cooling towers that have antifoulant biocides. The state water quality standards come from the Clean Water Act's Section 303 impaired waters list. And from that comes the total maximum daily load waste allocations. Anyway, I'm just pointing this out. There's a lot of monitoring and thinking and work that goes to turn the idea that you can't affect the wastewaters, you can't affect the waters of the United States to cause trouble with them. I'm losing my words. I need a caffeine burst right now. That you can't detrimentally affect the waters of the United States. And because of that, taking that idea that the waters have to be preserved for their uses, there is a long process that states go through to determine what that is, what actual limits apply to cause that, to protect the waters themselves. So there's the water quality standards. They get converted to water quality-based effluent limits for the permit discharges themselves, or reasonable potential analysis. And then the pretreatment regulations extend that out into your sewer district, because your discharges into your sewer district cannot cause impacts into the waterways. So here's how it works. Here's the state water quality standards for, I think this was South Bayside's. Anyway, here's the beneficial uses. They're defined by the state. The state has said, here's the uses of the waterway that the South Bayside sewage treatment plant's discharging into. And then for each one of those, the state has come up with what are protective numbers for each one of these beneficial uses: shellfish harvesting, fish migration. There's a lot of technology, a lot of science involved at this stage right here to come up with beneficial uses and what protects that waterway so that those beneficial uses can still be maintained. From that, they turn it into this reasonable potential analysis. This first column here, let's see, the first column, MEC, or minimum detection limit, that's the data. So they're taking samples from the sewage treatment plant, and here's the data. Here's how much antimony, here's how much arsenic, here's how much beryllium there is, and they just write it out. If it's below the detection limit, then they write the detection limit in there. And then they have the governing water quality objectives, or water quality limits themselves, this set. And these come from the analysis and the scientific studies that have been done how to protect that waterway for those uses to be still protected. So they come up with all these numbers that have to do with, here's copper. That's in particular, that's the one, right? That's 4.2 micrograms per liter is the lowest water quality-based limit to protect all of those uses of that estuary discharge. But over here, this is what the maximum effluent, this is the effluent sample concentration, is 14 micrograms per liter. And then here's the background number. So the waterway itself has got 2.55 as an average copper in it, micrograms per liter of copper. So based upon this, and there's some other factors that are involved in this process as well. They come up with, is it a reasonable potential to violate or to exceed that water quality objective? Copper, yes. Then that limit gets placed into the NPDES permit, and now the discharge for South Bayside cannot exceed 4.2 or whatever it turns out to be when they do translators and all, but say 4.2 micrograms per liter of copper. Now they have to convert that back up into the waste stream, into the discharges into the sewer district itself, so that they don't exceed this number, since copper is not removed directly by the sewage treatment plant, only indirectly. So there's this analysis is very, very involved, because you're trying to measure effects. You're trying to be protective of effects. So they convert this to MPDS permit limit. There's copper again, should be there. There it is. They have a translator, and they ended up converting it to that number. This is more water quality based limits that have to do with acute toxicity. And the thing is, the state does this. They figure it out, they apply it, and the sewer district has to be protective of this so that the sewage treatment plant does not violate these limits. Yes, ma'am.
So if you get a limit that's tighter than the one that's in your current permit, you need to work your way back to see what industries are potentially giving it to you and revise those permits?
That's correct. And in fact, that's probably the hardest thing that I did was a local limits. They're called local limits reviews. And when I was at EPA, I just said, do the local limits review. That's what we'd say. And we'd look at it, that's bad, we'd cross it out, red mark it and all that. But when I had to do it, it was really hard. It was a lot of data, a lot of statistics, a lot of making conclusions without enough sampling. I mean, it was very difficult. But that analysis has to be done because you're trying to be protective of the waterway so that your sewage treatment plant doesn't have a discharge that affects the waterway. And your sewage district is on the hook for that. The discharger can discharge something, but you're on the hook for it. So anyway, I'm just showing what the requirements are. And then there's this other set of limits. So there's receiving water limits as well, meaning that they're often narrative. But for example, in the end, you can't have floating or suspended deposited microscopic particulate matter into the receiving water itself. The estuary can't have that outside of the discharge from the sewage treatment plant. You know the little micro beads that are in shampoos and stuff like that? They are this, deposited macroscopic particulate matter. And so there's places that are outside of sewage treatment plants in which the microbeads are like a shelf. There's a whole bunch of them that are appearing now. And that's a violation of the receiving water limits. In the state of California, that'd be a violation of it because this is the state of California's receiving water limits. Can't affect the bottom deposit. Can't have bottom deposits that affect the aquatic growth, turbidity, color, visible floating deposited oil. You know the concentration of oil has to be below 10%, 10 milligrams per liter for there not to be a visible, really obvious sheen. So that number itself is essentially this can be turned into a number that the water discharge into the waterway can't exceed 10 milligrams per liter of oil, total oil, toxics. What was the one that we did? Soap bubbles coming out of the treatment plant, right? So that was another one. And then there might be compliance schedules that'll be in the permit itself. This one has compliance schedules for copper because they needed now to do something about the copper limits. They had reasonable potential to violate the new limits. Now they've got to do local limits evaluations. Maybe it's not the sources themselves. Maybe it's corrosion from waterway, from pipes. You know, there's a lot of things that go into that. Okay, so those are water quality standards. Then there's biosolids sludge limits that apply as well. And they come from Section 504 of the Clean Water Act, but they get implemented in an MPDS permit that essentially says that you have to have sludge that is disposable or reusable. So sludge itself can't have a lot of stuff in it then. It can't have a lot of copper. It can't have a lot of chrome. It has to have low levels of that or it can't be used again. It can't be used as a crop. It can't be, anyways, so there's sludge limits that apply as well, and these actually drive local limits a lot. I think the sludge limits drive local limits maybe as much as anything. And here's the sludge limits. Table 1 is for landfill disposal. It's in milligrams per kilogram, so mass-based number. And then tables 2 and 3 are land application of bulk product and then sold product. They're all, some of them are very low numbers. Some of them are higher. Depends on what you do. This is expensive. Landfill disposal is expensive. So a sewer district has a great interest in trying to be able to do something cheaper. Okay. This is the slide I want to get to. There's your sewer district. There's your sources. Here's where all the various limits apply. Best available technology applies right here at the sewage district's discharge, yes? It applies at certain categoricals, certain industries that have limits themselves of best available technology limits applied. The water quality-based standards apply just here at the end of the sewage treatment plant's discharge. The sludge limits apply just here at the end of the sewage treatment plant's sludge handling facility. These get, this one here, the water quality standards themselves, the receiving water standards apply out here, out into the waterway. Can't have floating solids, you can't have suds, right? You can't have microbeads, that kind of stuff. And then there's finally this, maximum allowable headworks load. So all of these requirements, the sewage treatment plant is required to make sure these things aren't exceeded, this number is not exceeded, that number is not exceeded, that number is not exceeded. Sewage treatment plant has all those requirements that they have to make sure that they're able to protect their sewage treatment plant from violating these various numbers. And then from that comes maximum allowable headworks loads for all of the pollutants of concern. And those maximum allowable headworks loads really just apply right there. That the influent of the sewage treatment plant can only accept X pounds per day of copper, or it'll violate this, or it might violate that, or it might violate that. Does that make sense? Now, from this, though, you have to translate that upstream. All of these together has to be less than that number. So, there's other sources as well of what would be the maximum allowable headworks loads is already a calculation that has taken into account that non-regulated sources, households themselves, discharge a lot of copper or whatever the pollutant is, that this number here is taking into account the whole system and what's left over to allocate to somebody to discharge over background numbers. That's what this is up here. This analysis I found when I did it was technically very, you had to be very precise about it, a lot of data handling. I thought that this was fairly difficult to do. And then finally, there's some limits that have to do with you can't destroy the pipes that are coming down to the sewage treatment plant. You can't cause explosions. You can't cause, they don't have the guy, but so next, before the explosion, there's the guy right here. Oh, here he is. He's breathing in something that's going to make him keel over because it's coming through the sewer system itself. Anyway, I like this drawing, yes. Yes, any questions? Clean Water Act basics, technology-based standards, water quality-based standards. Yes?
Could you comment on the admissibility of, let's say, you have yourself, you're a sewage treatment plant, you have an NPDES of some sort, either in your permit or a regional permit or somewhere. But you haven't done an analysis of the maximum allowable headworks loading or a load allocation in any way. Can you then, or comment on the appropriateness of lifting this discharge limit that you have and then applying it to your industrial discharge community?
Just applying it directly?
Yes.
So the evaluation of local limits, which is what limits actually cause this to occur so that this is not exceeded. evaluation of the local limits themselves is to translate this maximum allowable headworks loads into what is protective up here. If you took this standard down here, 4.2 micrograms per liter copper, and you applied it to every other facility up here, nobody could meet it. In fact, your household might not, many houses wouldn't meet it as well. So no, you have to go through the process of evaluating what number here is protective of that number there. And here's the thing, many of the pollutants themselves are removed by the process itself, but inadvertently. It's not designed for it. Copper will adhere to the sludge and at a rate, and it depends on your facility. Some facilities, that removal rate can be as high as 85, 90%. Some of them might be in the 40s or 30s. Just depends on the facility and where you are, whether or not the copper adheres to biologically, as an example. So a lot of copper goes out this direction, which means this number here has a mass and this one could be higher. This mass is 1 over 0.085, it was 85%. So you have a much higher mass there. The sewer district itself, most of the flows aren't industrial. They might have a much lower copper concentration. So these numbers can be much higher than 4.2 micrograms per liter. Was that your question?
Yeah.
Why not just apply the water quality standards here to there?
No, not why.
Yeah.
Is it good practice?
It's bad practice.
Thank you.
Because 4.2 micrograms per liter would mean every other discharger in your district would be violating your limit. And it would not be technically based. And then EPA would come through and say, you know, that ham-handed way that we use, that's not technically based, and we're going to write up an order on you. So anyway, that's a good question. Do you have any other questions about this? Yes. What?
How come there are no limits for that, what is that surfactant that's toxic?
Non-ionic?
No, non-ox, non-soxy.
Yeah.
You know, the one the European Union has banned. How come there's no limits for that?
Beats me. Why? Do you have the answer?
No, I don't have it.
Yeah, I don't
I
know.
wonder why it's not limited. Do you think there'll be PFAS limits?
So here's the thing. Water quality standards are state-driven. Does that make sense? States drive it. The federal government drives the technology-based standards. The federal government comes up with some guidelines maybe about these are pollutants of concern. States, though, define through the process of scientific inquiry what's protective of their uses. Now, these limits, that non-ionic surfactant might turn out to be an issue, and a state might eventually say, we're going to have a limit on that, as it's done with many things along the way. But it's state-driven, so it's slower. Yes, sir.
Are federal pretreatment requirements equally applicable if a sanitation district does not discharge to water the city?
That's a great question. That one's, do pretreatment requirements apply to discharges to sewer districts that don't discharge to a water of the United States? There has been a sense that they sort of can, because the pretreatment requirements applied to, especially if the sewage district sewage treatment plant was built with federal funds. That's kind of a hook, yes. And also the sludge itself is regulated. So because there is some federal regulation involved in it, there's been some sense that pretreatment standards, the pretreatment program applies. Now, the federal government never tested that out in a case and left it to states to do it. And the states did apply that. So there are a number of dischargers, districts in California that don't discharge to waterways. Bakersfield, big one, if I'm not mistaken. There's numbers in Arizona as well. There's Kingman. And they have pretreatment programs, but they're running on the idea that the state is saying we're requiring this in the NPDES permit, and the federal government is behind it saying, yeah, we're kind of there. The federal government says, I think that the federal government can support that idea. But yes, the Clean Water Act is for discharges to waters of the United States. So, okay. Any other questions?
It's kind of related to, industrial permitting every 5 years, and let's say with your local limits or your, where you keep tightening up the limits?
Well, the local limits, to be technically based, they have to be protective of that number there that the state gives you in the NPDES permit, the water quality standards, the receiving water standards that come from the NPDES permit as well, and the sludge limits. There's also some internal things. You can't inhibit the processes themselves, so there's some other numbers that come in here as well. But the limits themselves then come from a maximum allowable headworks load that is protective of those things. If those things don't change, this should stay the same, yes. If those things change, they could become less stringent or more stringent, you don't know. Then that number could change.
So a complaint we've got, like from industries, is let's say we've got compliance 5 years, 10 years, and then we issue a new permit, we keep dropping our local limits or our limitation on them, and then we get a non-compliance from that.
Yes.
Because they've been pretty consistent.
So technology-based standards, water quality-based standards, every discharge's got to meet them both. So if this is tightening up for reasons that have to do with the permit itself or the use of the water or your sewer district is growing or whatever, if that's tightening up, then it's tightening up.
So the main reason in our district, we've lost a lot of categoricals.
Yes.
So then how it was explained to me, it's like a pie. You have a percentage of the pie for industries. But I don't know, we just keep tightening it, but do we need to?
Well, so to take this and apply it up here as limits, there's all kinds of ways, right? You could take this, which is a mass number. Maximum allowable headworks load is a mass. 15 pounds per day of copper. And you could apply it upstream as a uniform concentration number, saying, here's my little section of industrial discharges. Here's how much. I have 10% of the flow is industrial discharges. So of that 15, that's a maximum allowable headworks loads, we're going to just uniformly turn that into a concentration-based number. Well, that can tighten up a lot depending on what's going on in it. But there's other ways, right? There's other ways. You can do much more fine analysis and say, of these 10% of industrial users that are discharging, 7% of them discharge at the background level for copper. So we're not going to allocate any of this maximum allowable headworks loads to them, their background. We're going to allocate it only to those 3% that's left. That's possible too, because the point is that these mass numbers in the end have to be less than that. That's all. So you can allocate any way you wish. There's all kinds of fancy ways to deal with detection limit issues and changes of limits and lowering of standards and all that stuff. It's a lot of stuff you can do. Yes?
So if you see industries leaving, then that would mean that there's more mass available to allocate and raise those local limits?
That's correct.
Is that something you see in practice?
The one that I did with Orange County, they raised limits the last time. They raised a few of them.
Well, that's only if your maximum allowable headworks loading changes. I mean, if you're allocating to individual industries, then
Right.
you can reallocate.
That's right. No. I mean, they raised limits because these changed up here.
Right, if you're,
Yes.
if you're giving it to individual districts.
Right. They did.
So would that explain why, like in metal finishing, circuit board shops have no limit for tin, but your centralized waste treatment has a very low limit for tin? So you're trying to protect that, what's coming into the allocation?
The picking of what is a pollutant of concern for each one of those categorical standards is nationwide issue. And the picking of them They started with the 15. You know the 15 pollutants of concern that started everything. That's what the sludge numbers are, and that's what the categorical standards are assessed with to begin with. But the centralized waste treatment's a much later rule. And you look at the later rules, and they add in all kinds of pollutants of concern that weren't in there before. A lot of organics, tin. I didn't know tin's in there, but
Tin, vanadium, titanium.
yeah. That's because they would have been pollutants of concern prior. They're just not now, and this is the category that has those limits. Has that pollutant load. Yes, sir.
Greg, can you add anything other to what's already out in publications and information on the 439 reg regarding the bioengineering exemption?
No, I can't. I'm sorry. You're on your own with that one. So let me see the time. I've got 10 minutes. I have a couple other slides, and they're just sort of self-analysis of the Clean Water Act. There's a lot of environmental compliance under the Clean Water Act. There's a lot of you working here, but there's a lot of environmental compliance, and it's because it's mostly above board. It's sampling, it's permitting, it's people walking through. It's not a lot of self-assessments. It's just essentially that, and it is diffused power. I once, I was a federal inspector, and I had no power at all. You could not actually bribe me because I didn't have any power, and I was the most powerful guy in the room, and I didn't have any power at all, because everyone has to be convinced. State, local governments, different agencies, bosses, public, that because it's so above board and there's a lot of diffused power, I just didn't. You couldn't really bribe a inspector or anything. It was really hard to do. Very diffused power. When I went to China, I did a series of talks in China, and there the inspector has the power to shut the place down just by walking through and saying, I don't like this. Mexico too. They can walk through and say, I see you're violating your pH limit. You must shut down right now. Too much power in that person. That person can be bribed. Well, here's $100,000. Okay. Me, if I found that pH violation, well, I'm going to have to write this up and send you an order, and then I got to convince lawyers and see what the state thinks, and then if we go to trial, it'll be 6 years from now. And the process itself means that I didn't have any power. The process itself, because there's diffused power, it's above board. There's a lot of compliance. Anyway, that's the first thing. It's definable. It's achievable. It's best available technology as the driver. The ones that are difficult that have to do the water quality-based standards, it comes through a lot of science, though. It has to pass through a lot of analysis to become an actual limit that actually impacts somebody. It's measurable. You're coming up with, if you're not allowed to discharge that waste stream, for example, the measurability is you walking in and seeing it's not being discharged. If it's a limit, you're taking a sample, and the rules allow me to take the sample. And it's consistent. It's the same thing. The permit requires sampling for this, checking for that. Because it's so objective, defined compliance, it's really high compliance because of that. And then finally, it's open records. Anyone can look at it. Once the records end up in your district, somebody can say, I want to see them. They can see them. You can see them. You can do split samples. You can do duplicate samples. The open process itself means there's a lot of above board compliance. And that's really good. I inspected 700 places, was involved in maybe 1,000 facilities overall. And I was involved in trials for 4 of them, maybe. So that's a good system. You're not having to, by trial, cause things to happen, by the most expensive enforcement-related thing. It's mostly people comply because it's above board and it's achievable. It's a level playing field, pretty much. national standards, national enforcement policies. When there was an enforcement case, it was to recover the economic benefit of noncompliance. So that was the way that you'd calculate a penalty if it was a civil case, plus a little bit more so they wouldn't have the incentive to do that. But the point was essentially that we're going to level the playing field if you're a violator of federal standards or local limits. Your competitor had to do this, you have to do this. And for that reason, there's lots of compliance. Level playing field matters a ton. Mexico, not a level playing field. You can go in and somebody could give money to this person or that person, and the facility can do whatever it wants. Or this other facility doesn't give money and they can't do anything. They have to have political favors or something. Level playing field. I think last time I told you I was interfered with only twice politically at EPA, and I worked 30 years at EPA. And that's that's great. It's a good system if you're only interfered with 2 times. Here's your purpose, go and ensure that people comply with these limits. Interfered with twice. They were both awesome, but it's data-driven and it's predictable. Compliance is determined by sampling. Very data-driven. There's national guidelines for the test methods, and this case, not sampling is like violating. That's a very effective policy. So it drives everything towards sampling. Sampling has to do with treatment and treatability. Keeping the Clean Water Act is by and large trying to keep to the basics. Treatment, treatability. Sampling that verifies that. Prohibitions that ensure that that occurs. Most of the work is done by state and locals. That's so true. We did almost nothing, really, compared to what you all do. But it's national oversight, national reporting. So here's reasons why it's been very effective. The Clean Water Act is a very effective rule. And by and large, everybody in the country likes it, wants it. There's some issues with the Clean Water Act when it applies to stuff like discharges that aren't to waterways. Or big court case was discharged to a guy's farm. He has a little lake, small little pond on his farm. And is that covered? And that was a huge court case. Just the application of the Clean Water Act is an issue. But the act itself was well thought out, works very well. It's got a consistent idea. So there's little corruption, there's national standards, there's broad public support. It's a level playing field. It protects the public investment, which is the sewer districts. It's data-driven, predictable, state and local delegations. So China, when we went there, they wanted to do this, except they didn't want to give up the power. They really admired the United States way that the water is cleaned up, but man, it's a mess there. It was awful. You just see it. So because of that, most compliance is achieved through voluntary compliance. Almost everything is, yes, here's my permit, I'll meet it, I'll do it without you having to do anything to me. Some is achieved administratively with an order or something like that. And the use of governmental power through the courts is almost never necessary. And almost no criminal prosecution. One case, you've had one. In this room, we have, 15, 20 sewer districts, and I worked 30 years, and we have 5 or 6 criminal cases that we can point to. The system is extremely well run. Here's weaknesses. Data management is over the top. There's so much of it, especially now that they can submit stuff in electronically, which you've got to handle like it was before. Anyway, good luck with that. I've left just in time. Governmental sources of pollution are difficult. Military bases, state agencies. These are going to be more difficult than any other. Your own city, your city maintenance yard, if you're a city-run district, it will be the most troublesome for you. Because you can't, if you do something to them, it's like taking money out of your right pocket and putting it into your left. It doesn't really do anything. Developing regulatory capability. The person like me that knew treatability and chemistry and the regulations, and saw a lot of industry and was all over the place, is an expensive person to have in every sewer district. You can't really have that person. If you're big enough, if you're San Jose, you might have one. If you're Union San and you got a lot of industry, you might have something like that. But it's difficult to develop that capability because it takes a lot of industry and it takes a lot of technical background to get there. And most of the sewer districts don't have the broadness of industry to support such a thing. So that's a weakness in it in a way, because as you can see, the categorical standards, the local limits, everything's driven by a lot of technology, a lot of sampling, handling statistics. The whole second session was about variability. How many of you took statistics? How many of you took 4 classes of statistics? Right. The sense of that it's driven, statistically driven, is it's hard, right? Statistics wasn't that easy. And it's all driven by statistics. So the developing regulatory capability is difficult, I think. It's a weakness. The complexity of the regulations, the premise behind the regulations isn't complex, but the way that it's being implemented these days is very complex. The permits before for a sewer district might have been 15, 20 pages. They're like 300 now, yes? Have any of you seen your NPDES permit? Especially here in the state of California. Does anybody here work for the state of California? Would you please apologize for the 300-page permits? I don't know. I think I know who he is. Anyway.
We have a few in the room.
I know.
They're really great people.
They are. But the permits are 300 pages long, of which you can violate all sorts of stuff in there. It's very complex. The complexity has increased a ton, and that's a weakness in the end, because the more complex it is, the more difficult it is to manage it toward its purpose, which is control of pollutants and variability. And then there's an ever-moving target, like you were mentioning. The limits change, and they just do. Anyway, any questions or comments? Clean Water Act basics. We're right on time, I think. Yes? 12:01, sorry. So lunch, we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock. Hey, take a shot at the yellow test. See how you're doing.
You're amazing. The FO.